How could you betray the one you claim that you love so much? Where is the place of true love in the case of infidelity? Once admired and respected couples suddenly went against each other. What made their marriage go sour overnight? A wife orchestrated the death of her husband in this thoughtful story. Grab your seat, sit down and watch. Learn and teach others from this love story that led to a murder. Welcome to Infidelity HQ. I thank you, my viewers, most especially my subscribers, for your unwavering support as we keep improving and bringing daily told and untold true infidelity crime stories. Please don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you are yet to do so. David Bennett had everything a man could want. He was successful, well-respected, and living in a large, beautifully decorated house in a peaceful neighborhood. As a lawyer, he had worked tirelessly to build his career. His reputation as a sharp, reliable professional had earned him the admiration of his peers and the trust of his clients. In the courtroom, his calm demeanor and logical approach made him nearly invincible. But as he sat at his desk in the quiet of his study late one evening, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease that he couldn't place. Something wasn't quite right. His wife, Sarah, seemed different lately. She was still beautiful, with a warm smile that had once captivated him from the moment they met. But something in her eyes had changed. There was a distance there now. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there nonetheless. The woman who once clung to him with excitement and passion now seemed to withdraw more and more into herself. David tried to ignore it. He was busy with work after all. He was a man who lived for his career, for the success he had earned, and for the respect that came with it. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Sarah, for her part, loved David. She had loved him from the moment they met, or at least she had thought she did. Their marriage had always been steady, comfortable, predictable. David had been everything she needed, a provider, a protector, a man who took care of all the details of their life together. She had settled into the rhythm of their relationship, appreciating the stability he offered. But in the quiet moments when she was alone with her thoughts, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She had longed for excitement, for adventure, for passion. David was kind, generous, and dependable, but he didn't set her heart racing anymore. The passion they once shared seemed to have faded into the background of their day-to-day life. Then there was Daniel Reeves. He was a personal trainer at the local gym where Sarah had started working out again, hoping to regain some of her youthful energy and vitality. Daniel was everything David was not. He was spontaneous, charming, and full of energy. He didn't wear suits or carry the weight of responsibility that David did. Instead, he wore workout clothes and radiated a carefree confidence that drew people in. He wasn't like the quiet professional Sarah had grown used to. He was brash, fun, and a little reckless, a stark contrast to the steady life she had built with David. It started innocently enough. Sarah had always been friendly with Daniel, but nothing more. She came to the gym regularly, and he would greet her with a smile and a compliment, always respectful, always friendly. But slowly the conversations began to linger. Daniel would offer to help Sarah with her workout, and soon their interactions became more personal. He would ask about her day, her dreams, her frustrations. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt seen, not just as a wife or a mother, but as a person. And Daniel didn't seem to care about the ring on her finger or the fact that she was married. He was only interested in who she was, right then and there. One evening, as they finished a workout together, Daniel suggested they grab a coffee. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but there was something about his easy smile, his inviting presence, that made her say yes. It wasn't meant to be anything more than a friendly gesture, but it would be the first step down a path Sarah hadn't intended to walk. That coffee turned into another, and then another. The conversation flowed effortlessly between them, and before long, they were meeting outside the gym. Sarah found herself drawn to Daniel in a way she hadn't felt in years. She would think about him during the day, her mind drifting to their conversations. She began dressing a little differently, doing her hair in ways that made her feel more alive. She didn't tell David, of course. She didn't want to worry him. She didn't want to feel guilty. But the truth was, she was starting to enjoy the attention. The thrill of being wanted in a way she hadn't felt in so long was intoxicating. Daniel made her feel beautiful, alive, and exciting. He didn't ask her to be anyone but herself, and that was something she had longed for. With David, she had always been the wife, the dependable partner. But with Daniel, she was just Sarah, the woman who could laugh without worry, the woman who didn't have to be perfect. She was someone different, someone she had forgotten existed. David didn't notice at first. He was too caught up in his work, too focused on his career. Sarah's new routine, the extra time at the gym, the late nights with friends, the occasional smile on her face, went unnoticed by him. He was a man who measured success in spreadsheets and courtrooms, not in the small, intimate moments of a relationship. He thought Sarah was just going through a phase, but the distance between them continued to grow. Their conversations became more superficial. They no longer had long talks about their dreams and hopes for the future. Instead, they talked about the bills, the kids, and what to have for dinner. It wasn't long before Sarah started to feel the pull of the affair with Daniel. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Daniel didn't just make her feel wanted. He made her feel seen, heard, understood in a way that David hadn't done in years. She didn't want to admit it, but the truth was, she was falling for him. The guilt gnawed at her, but it was buried under layers of longing and desire. David continued to live his life as if everything was fine. He would come home late from work, his briefcase in hand, and sit down to dinner with Sarah. They would talk about nothing, their conversations cold and distant. Sarah would smile and nod, pretending everything was as it should be, but inside her heart was pulling her in two directions. She wanted David. She still loved him in some ways, but she also wanted Daniel, a man who made her feel alive in a way that David no longer could. And so, Sarah Bennett found herself at a crossroads. She had everything she thought she wanted, but she was beginning to question whether that was enough. She didn't know it yet, but the choices she was making would lead to a devastating and irreversible chain of events. The affair was only the beginning. The days passed in a blur for Sarah, each one folding into the next with a mixture of guilt and excitement. She would wake up beside David each morning, their routines as predictable as the sunrise. They would have breakfast together, chat about the mundane, and then he would leave for the office. Her days followed a familiar pattern, taking care of the house, running errands, and caring for their two children. But in the quiet moments when no one was around, Sarah's mind would drift back to Daniel. It had started innocently, an exchange of glances, a lingering handshake after a workout. But now it was much more. The stolen moments between them had become something dangerous, something that felt too real to deny. They began meeting more frequently, slipping away from their busy lives to steal hours together. It wasn't just in the gym anymore. It was at coffee shops, quiet parks, or the occasional late-night drive. And each time, the connection between them deepened. Sarah felt like she was walking on a tightrope, balancing between her life with David and the new fiery connection she had with Daniel. The affair wasn't just about sex, though that part of it was electrifying. It was about the attention, the adoration, the feeling of being desired and valued in ways that David hadn't made her feel in years. Daniel's gaze was full of hunger, and when he touched her, it was with a sense of urgency that sent shivers down her spine. He was an escape, a fantasy she had created in her mind, a fantasy that allowed her to forget the reality of her marriage and the life she had built with David. But the more she saw Daniel, the more she realized that she was losing something she could never get back. The guilt started to creep in, slowly at first, like a shadow at the corner of her mind. When she was with David, she would find herself distracted, her thoughts wandering back to the moments she shared with Daniel. She would catch herself staring blankly at David, wondering if he knew, wondering if he could see through the smile she forced on her face. The guilt was always there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was quickly overshadowed by the rush of adrenaline she felt when she was with Daniel. The way he made her feel, alive, wanted, powerful, was intoxicating. She started to look for excuses to see him more often. Workouts became more frequent, late-night phone calls became longer, and their time together became more and more clandestine. The affair had become a part of her, something she couldn't quite shake, even as she knew the consequences of getting caught would be severe. David, meanwhile, had begun to notice the subtle changes in his wife. He wasn't the kind of man who liked to pry or question. He trusted Sarah, perhaps to a fault. But the small things, the way she looked at her phone more often, the late nights when she would claim to be working on a project, the way she seemed distant during their conversations, were impossible to ignore. At first, David brushed it off as nothing more than stress. She had been managing their home, running errands, and handling the kids. Maybe she was just overwhelmed. But as the days passed, the unease began to grow. One evening, David returned home from a long day at the office, tired and worn out. He had been working late, preparing for an important case, and had barely had time to think about anything else. But as soon as he walked through the door, he noticed something was different. The air in the house felt heavy, as if a storm were brewing just beyond the windows. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone with a faraway look in her eyes. When she looked up, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. David had known her long enough to recognize the difference. She was hiding something, and it was starting to eat away at him. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Sarah looked up at him, startled, as if she hadn't expected him to ask. She quickly nodded and put her phone down. "Yeah, just tired. You know, the usual," she said with a smile that didn't quite mask the tension in her voice. David felt a pang of doubt. He had learned not to question her every move, but this felt different. His mind began to race. Had something happened? Was she unhappy? Was there another man? He quickly pushed the thought away. That was ridiculous. Sarah loved him. She wouldn't do that. But as the days wore on, the doubt began to grow. David started paying more attention to Sarah's behavior. He noticed the small things, how she always seemed to have a new hairstyle, how she would dress up more for her trips to the gym, how she was always so busy when he was home. Something didn't add up. He wasn't sure what, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing her. The suspicion gnawed at him, but he didn't know how to confront it. He had built his life on trust, on the belief that his marriage was strong. He didn't want to face the possibility that it might not be. Meanwhile, Sarah was becoming more and more consumed by her secret. The affair was no longer something she could ignore or compartmentalize. It was in every conversation, every glance, every touch. Daniel was always there, lurking in the back of her mind. He was a part of her life now, and the guilt of keeping him hidden from David was beginning to tear her apart. She loved David, she truly did, but she was also falling deeper into the allure of Daniel, his confidence, his wild energy, the way he made her feel special. It was a dangerous game she was playing, one that she knew could have consequences. But at that moment, she didn't care. Her thoughts were often consumed with images of Daniel. She longed to feel his hands on her again, to taste the passion they shared. The affair had become more than just an escape. It was now a need, a hunger she couldn't deny. And with each day that passed, the pressure built. The secret burned inside of her, threatening to consume everything she had worked so hard to build. As she stood in front of the mirror one evening, preparing for another late-night meeting with Daniel, Sarah's reflection seemed foreign to her. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her, the woman who had once been so sure of herself, so secure in her life with David. Now she was a stranger, caught in a web of lies, guilt, and desire. And the worst part was, she couldn't seem to stop herself. The cold nights had become routine for David. He would sit at his desk long after the house had quieted, staring at files that needed his attention, but were pushed aside in favor of thoughts he could no longer ignore. His mind, once focused on his work, now lingered on his wife. The subtle changes in her behavior were starting to chip away at the perfect image he had of their life together. He couldn't explain it, didn't want to, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. Sarah had been distant lately. He thought it was stress. He told himself it was just a phase. But there were nights when he watched her staring at her phone, a smile flickering on her face whenever she read a text or answered a call, that the nagging feeling inside him grew. He couldn't put a name to it, but it was there, relentless, like an itch he couldn't scratch. A few weeks ago, at a dinner party with a close friend, David overheard something that made his stomach drop. James, an old colleague from work, had casually mentioned that he had seen Sarah at the gym more often than usual. James didn't mean anything by it. He was just trying to make small talk, mentioning how healthy Sarah looked. But David's gut twisted. Why was James keeping track of her workouts? It was a harmless comment, but for some reason, it struck a nerve. Later that night, after everyone had left, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He asked Sarah about it. "You've been going to the gym a lot lately," he said, trying to sound casual, even though the question felt like it was suffocating him from the inside. Sarah looked at him with wide eyes, her lips curving into a tight smile. "Yes, I've been trying to get back into shape, you know?" She shrugged, brushing it off. "It's nothing to worry about, David. I'm just trying to stay healthy." But David wasn't convinced. The smile she gave him didn't quite match her eyes. He had learned over the years how to read her expressions, how to detect the small signs that said more than words ever could. There was something in the way she looked away after speaking, the subtle pause before she answered, that made him feel uneasy. He wanted to trust her. He didn't want to question his wife, the woman he had built his life with. But the doubt continued to grow, crawling into his mind like a slow poison. He started paying attention to things he had once taken for granted, the way she would hum, softly to herself, as though lost in thought when she thought he wasn't paying attention. The way she spent more time on her phone, texting and scrolling, her face lighting up every time a new notification appeared. He even began noticing the small details, the way she would touch her hair more often, the way her clothes had changed, becoming more form-fitting, more revealing. David was no fool. He knew what it looked like when someone was hiding something, and he wasn't sure what it was, but he felt like Sarah was slipping away from him. The distance between them seemed to grow with each passing day. Late one evening, when Sarah was out at the gym for her usual workout, David decided he couldn't ignore his feelings any longer. He needed to know the truth. It wasn't like him to spy or snoop. He had always prided himself on his trust in people, in relationships. But in that moment, the overwhelming sense of suspicion drove him to take actions he never thought he would. He found himself standing by Sarah's phone, his hand hovering over it, debating whether to unlock it. He knew he shouldn't. He had no right to invade her privacy, no right to violate the trust they had built. But the urge was too strong. With shaky hands, he unlocked her phone. It was easy enough. Sarah had always kept her phone password simple. David had never needed to know it before. As he scrolled through the messages, he felt a sickening sensation in the pit of his stomach. Text messages between Sarah and someone named D casual exchanges at first, but as he read further, it became clear that there was more to the relationship than he had imagined. David's heart pounded in his chest. The messages were flirtatious, innocent at first but escalating. They were discussing their workouts, their favorite places to go for coffee, and then there were the more intimate exchanges. A joke here, a compliment there, and then a text that sent chills down David's spine. "I can't wait to see you again. Last time was perfect." He felt the air leave his lungs. He couldn't breathe. It was real. It wasn't just a suspicion. His wife, his Sarah, was having an affair. His mind raced. The evidence was right in front of him, but still, a part of him couldn't believe it. He thought back to all the moments he had shared with her, their wedding, their children, their plans for the future. Had it all been a lie? Had Sarah really fallen out of love with him, or had something deeper taken root, something he hadn't seen? For a long time, David just sat there staring at the screen. The words on the phone seemed to blur as his emotions swirled. Anger, hurt, confusion, betrayal. It felt as though his entire world had been shattered in an instant. He wanted to confront her then and there, to call her, to demand answers. But something inside him held him back. A part of him wanted to know more, to gather as much information as he could before making a move. It was a dangerous game, but at that moment David wasn't thinking about consequences. All he could think about was the overwhelming sense of betrayal that was coursing through his veins. He didn't tell Sarah that night. He couldn't. Instead, he decided to wait. He would confront her when he had all the pieces, when he understood the full extent of the situation. But one thing was certain. He was no longer the man he had been just hours ago. The trust he had placed in his wife had been shattered, and with it, his entire world. The days that followed David's discovery were a blur. He went through the motions, his work, his interactions with Sarah, his daily routine, but it all felt surreal. The anger that had simmered inside him was now a wildfire, threatening to consume him. Every glance at Sarah made his skin crawl. How could she do this to him? How could she betray him like this? He wanted to confront her. He wanted to scream, to demand an explanation. But the part of him that still loved her, the part that had spent years building a life with her, stopped him. He wasn't sure what was worse, the betrayal itself, or the fact that he hadn't seen it coming. How had he been so blind? Sarah, on the other hand, was living in a world of her own. Her affair with Daniel had become the center of her existence. It was both an escape and a prison, a place where she could feel alive and free, but also a place that demanded constant attention. The guilt was overwhelming at times, but the thrill of being with Daniel overshadowed it. She was addicted to the excitement, to the raw passion he brought into her life. Every time she saw David, she put on a mask. She smiled, spoke softly, did what was expected. But inside, her heart raced. Her mind was elsewhere. She was constantly torn between the two men, the stable, reliable David and the wild, impulsive Daniel. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. Daniel had a grip on her, a grip that was becoming stronger by the day. On the morning of the confrontation, David couldn't take it any longer. He had spent the entire night replaying every message, every word, every moment he had shared with Sarah. His emotions had settled into something colder, something more dangerous. The time for uncertainty was over. He was going to confront her, and he wasn't going to let her lie her way out of this. When Sarah came downstairs that morning, she found him sitting at the kitchen table, a look of intensity in his eyes that she had never seen before. For a moment, she felt a pang of dread in her chest. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in the air, the tension thick between them. "David, you're up early," she said, trying to keep her voice light, but it came out strained. David didn't respond right away. He just sat there, his gaze fixed on her. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, as Sarah nervously fidgeted with her coffee cup. She could feel the walls closing in on her. Finally, David spoke, his voice low but steady. "We need to talk." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. She had no idea what was coming, but she knew deep down that this was the moment. This was the moment she had been dreading. "I've seen the messages, Sarah," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know about you and Daniel." The words hit her like a slap across the face. For a second, she felt the ground beneath her feet give way. She wanted to deny it, to lie, to tell him it wasn't what he thought. But the truth was right there in front of her. The guilt she had been carrying for so long was now a weight she couldn't escape. Her voice faltered as she tried to speak. "David, I didn't mean for it to happen. It just happened." Her words sounded weak, even to her own ears. David stood up slowly, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "You didn't mean for it to happen? Sarah, you've been lying to me for months. To my face? You've been seeing him behind my back, and all you can say is that it just happened?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She wanted to explain, to make him understand, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain what had happened? How could she explain that, in her search for something more, she had found herself in a place she never intended to go? "I'm sorry, David. I am. But I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to fix what was broken between us," she said, her voice shaking now. David shook his head, disbelief and anger flashing across his face. "Broken? What's broken, Sarah? Our marriage? Our family? Everything we built together. How long has this been going on? How long have you been hiding this from me?" Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The truth hung in the air, suffocating her. She had been lying, yes, but she had also been lying to herself. She had convinced herself that the affair was just a mistake, something she could walk away from when the time came. But now the consequences of her actions were crashing down on her, and she was powerless to stop them. "I never wanted to hurt you, David," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I swear, I never meant for any of this to happen." David stared at her, his expression hardening. "You've already hurt me, Sarah, and you've hurt us. I don't know if I can forgive you for this." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was deafening, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on their shoulders. Sarah could feel the walls closing in, the air thick with tension. She knew that this was it, the moment of reckoning. David's mind was racing. He felt betrayed in a way he never thought possible. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted, had turned out to be someone entirely different. He didn't know how to fix this. He didn't know if he even wanted to. The pain was too much. Finally, he turned away from her, his voice cold and distant. "I need space, Sarah. I need time to think. I don't know if I can keep living like this." Sarah watched him, tears now streaming down her face. She wanted to reach out to him, to beg for forgiveness, to fix what she had broken. But deep down, she knew it was too late. The damage had been done. The days after the confrontation were a blur of silence and cold tension between David and Sarah. Their home, once filled with laughter and light, now felt like a mausoleum, every room echoing with the unspoken words neither was brave enough to utter. Sarah spent most of her time in the bedroom, staring at the walls, her mind racing with guilt, regret, and a growing sense of desperation. She knew she had lost David. She had betrayed him in a way that no apology could ever fix. But it wasn't just David she had to worry about. It was Daniel. The affair, once full of passion and excitement, had started to feel like a trap. Every time Sarah closed her eyes, she could see Daniel's face, the reckless, carefree smile, the touch that once made her feel alive. But now it felt hollow. Their secret meetings, once thrilling, were becoming increasingly suffocating. Daniel, too, had started to change. He no longer looked at Sarah with the same fire in his eyes. There was an edge to his behavior now, an impatience, an urgency that made her uneasy. She had known deep down that the affair was never meant to last. But the way it was falling apart, the way everything was unraveling, terrified her. Daniel called her late one night, just days after her confrontation with David. The tension between them was palpable as soon as she picked up the phone. "Sarah," Daniel's voice was low, almost urgent. "We need to talk." She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "About what?" she asked, trying to sound composed. "This thing between us, it's not working anymore. You're too tied up in your marriage, and I can't be part of that. I'm done, Sarah. I don't have time for games." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. She had known it was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way she hadn't expected. "You can't just walk away like this," she said, panic creeping into her voice. "You can't just throw everything away." "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Daniel said sharply. "You need to figure out what you really want. I'm out." The line went silent as Sarah's thoughts spiraled. The affair had been her escape from the suffocating reality of her marriage, but now it was collapsing. Daniel was gone, and David, her husband, the man she had betrayed, was slipping further away with each passing day. The next morning she woke up to the sound of David packing his things. He had been distant, hardly speaking to her since their confrontation, but now he was preparing to leave. The finality of it hit her hard. She ran into the living room just as he zipped up his suitcase. "David, please," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Don't leave. We can fix this. We can work through this." David stopped and turned to face her, his eyes filled with a coldness she had never seen before. "Sarah, I don't know if I can do that. You've broken me. You've broken us. I don't know how to fix it anymore." His words were like daggers to her heart, but she couldn't let him go. Not like this. Not without trying everything to salvage what was left of their life together. "Please, David, we have kids. We have a family. Don't walk away from everything we've built." But David shook his head, his expression hardening. "It's not just about the kids, Sarah. It's about trust, and you've destroyed that. I need time. I need space to think. I don't even know if I can come back from this." As he turned to leave, Sarah felt the ground beneath her feet shift. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. She had driven David to this point, pushed him away with her lies, her betrayal. The guilt flooded her, suffocating her. But as she watched him leave, something inside her snapped. The world around her seemed to darken, and the fragile grip she had on her emotions began to slip. She couldn't lose both of them. She couldn't lose David, and she certainly couldn't let go of Daniel, if only to stop the pain from crushing her. Her desperation to hold on to what she thought she needed pushed her to a place she never thought she would go. With trembling hands, she grabbed her phone and dialed Daniel's number. She needed him now. She needed him to fix the mess she had created, to tell her that everything would be okay, that he could save her from the abyss she had fallen into. When Daniel answered, his tone was cold, detached. "What is it, Sarah?" "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't lose both of you. I can't. You have to come back. We have to fix this." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Daniel spoke again, his voice laced with bitterness. "Sarah, you've got to let go. This is over." The finality of his words hit her like a freight train. "No, please," she begged. "I'm begging you. I need you. I can't be alone." But Daniel had already made up his mind. "You've already made your choice, Sarah. You chose your husband. You chose your family. Don't try to pull me back into your mess. It's too late." As the call ended, Sarah's world shattered. She had lost everything. In the frantic blur of emotions, the rage and pain overcame her completely. The thought of David leaving her, of Daniel walking away from her for good, drove her into a blind fury. In that moment, all she could think of was making them feel what she felt: betrayed, abandoned, and alone. That night, in the darkness of her living room, Sarah made a decision. It wasn't a rational one, or even a conscious one. It was an impulse, a desperate need to make everything stop, to make the pain go away. She grabbed the knife from the kitchen drawer, her hands shaking violently as she thought of David, of Daniel, and of the way they had both discarded her. With a deep breath, she set out to find them. David had just finished locking the door when he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Before he could turn around, a sharp pain sliced through his back. He collapsed to the ground, a gasp escaping his lips as his life quickly began to slip away. Sarah stood over him, the knife still gripped tightly in her hand, the world around her spinning. She didn't recognize herself in that moment. All she could see was the man she had loved, the man she had betrayed, and the pain of losing him. And then, the darkness of her actions consumed her. The next morning, the police arrived at their house to a scene of horror. Sarah, in a daze, sat in the living room, her clothes soaked in blood. David was gone. She had taken everything from him, everything from them both. The town was left reeling, struggling to make sense of the crime of passion that had shattered two lives forever. And as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the affair, the lies, and the desperation had led to a tragedy that no one could have predicted.